All right, hey ho, let's go. This is Resistance Radio, where natural selection selects resistance and our policies keep selecting the same old mistakes. Tonight, we're going to dive into three things: a quick news sweep, a closer look at the Cyclospora mess, and then a deeper dive into what COVID should have taught us about preparing for the next big respiratory pandemic and why, sadly, we're still not there. So let's start with the headlines. First up, the parasite in your produce. Since May 1st, as we know, the CDC has logged 4,173 laboratory confirmed domestically acquired cases of cyclosporiasis across 41 states. And they're looking at more than 7,400 additional reports that haven't yet been confirmed in the lab. That's over 11,500 people who are either definitely or very likely sick from the same microscopic parasite in just a few months. Picture a packed NBA arena where everyone has days of watery, sometimes explosive diarrhea. And on top of that, 308 people have been hospitalized, and health officials are juggling multiple overlapping clusters rather than one neat, traceable outbreak. One of those clusters has a familiar villain, and that is iceberg lettuce. An ongoing outbreak in Indiana, Kentucky, Michigan, Ohio, and West Virginia has been linked to lettuce from Taylor Farms to Mexico that went into Taco Bell salads and had some packaged products sold through retailers like Walmart. Thousands have fallen ill in Michigan and Northwest Ohio alone, and the company has issued a recall covering a range of products across 27 states. Around the same time, separate state-level investigations have tied similar cyclospora clusters to herbs like parsley and cilantro that have been served raw, and the FDA is probing a brand new 72-case outbreak. So this is new, a 72-case outbreak where they still haven't identified the product. So this isn't a single bad head of lettuce. It's a summer of contaminated supply chains. All right, let's move through the headlines. Second headline here is measles is back on the stage again, yet this time it's a headliner because new national data show that 2,295 measles cases that have been reported so far this year, which is now surpassing all of 2025, marking the highest U.S. total in 35 years. About 10% of kids under the age of 5 and 10% of adults under 20 with measles have needed hospitalization, which is what happens when a virus that should have been boxed in by vaccines find big enough gaps in coverage. Think of the community immunity like a brick wall. Measles needs only a few missing bricks to blow through that whole structure. And finally, a quick look outward, and let's speak specifically globally and how the WHO and its partners are still dealing with Bundibugyo strain of Ebola in Central Africa, avian influenza threats, and West Nile virus, foodborne outbreaks like the same Cyclospora surge we're seeing here, and more, all while asking the blunt question 6 years after COVID's global alarm. Are we actually better prepared for the next pandemic, or are we just better at writing after action reports? Their own answer is honestly yes and no, and we'll come back to that in just a few minutes. But let's stay with Cyclospora for just a quick minute, because this is where food safety, federal capacity, and equity all collide. Cyclospora is a microscopic parasite that gets into food when it comes into contact with human feces, usually through contaminated irrigation water or wash water. Unlike many bacteria, you can't just grow it easily in the lab culture, which makes detection harder and more time consuming. Tiny amounts on fresh produce, especially things we eat raw like lettuce and herbs, are going to make people sick, and the illness can drag on for weeks with explosive watery diarrhea, cramping, bloating, and fatigue. Imagine planning your summer around kids' camps and cookouts and instead planning your life around the nearest bathroom. The basic public advice is familiar. Wash your hands, rinse fresh produce under clean running water, and cook foods when you can, because heating produce to at least 158 degrees Fahrenheit can kill the parasite. But here's the uncomfortable truth. By the time the advice reaches people's screens, many of them are already sick. No amount of careful rinsing in your kitchen can undo contaminated irrigation water in the field or systemic gaps in oversight along the supply chain. Right now, the CDC and the FDA are clear that they do not have the evidence of one single product linking all cases. This is a national surveillance tally that includes multiple clusters plus sporadic cases. Some clusters are tied to the Taylor Farms lettuce from central Mexico, some to other produce like parsley and cilantro, and at least one 72-person cluster is still source unknown as FDA's traceback investigations continue. That complexity isn't just a biological problem, it's a policy problem. When you have underregulated growing conditions, fragmented traceability requirements, and underfunded surveillance systems, it becomes much harder to figure out which salad from which field made which people sick. The numbers tell you something else. The burden is not evenly distributed. Many of the additional 7,400 suspected cases are coming out of Michigan and Ohio. And we know that people who rely heavily on fast food, packaged salads, or limited choice grocery options are more likely to encounter contaminated produce and less likely to have the time, money, or access to seek rapid care. Cyclospora doesn't care whether you're working two jobs, but our policies around food safety, agriculture, water standards, and public health funding do. And when these policies fail, the people with the least amount of power are the ones who end up sick the longest. And that brings us to the deeper question. And what, if anything, did we learn from COVID that applies here and to the next respiratory pandemic that's waiting in the wings? The WHO recently laid out 7 big lessons from COVID in a commentary on pandemic preparedness, and this is worth translating into plain language. So their starting point is blunt. COVID was devastating, but the conditions that allowed the SARS-CoV-2 virus to explode haven't changed nearly enough. And they give us several lessons to learn from. So lesson 1 is that the global threats demand global solidarity. Viruses and parasites move faster than borders, and you can't protect one country without letting others struggle. So the WHO argues that solidarity has to be designed into preparedness, into how data are shared, how supplies are allocated, and how manufacturing is distributed, not improvised on the fly after a crisis is already global. Lesson number 2, equity has to be built in from the start, not stapled on as a charity program. During COVID, vaccines were developed in record time, but access was concentrated in wealthy countries where variants burned through under-resourced regions. The WHO is now trying to shift that architecture with things like mRNA technology transfer hub in South Africa and a global biomanufacturing training hub in the Republic of Korea. So that means more regions can develop and produce their own vaccines and health technologies. The idea is simple. If you don't fix who controls the recipes in the factories, you repeat the same inequities the next time. Lesson number 3, strong everyday health systems are the real surge capacity. Countries that had robust primary care and community health workers and functioning public health networks weathered COVID better than those that relied on emergency measures layered onto weak systems. Preparedness is not a special toolbox on the shelf waiting for the big one. It's the day-to-day work of lab capacity, surveillance, and staffed clinics, as well as trusted local relationships. Lesson number 4, speed, transparency, and trust save lives. WHO underscores that time lost is lives lost. The longer it takes to detect an event, share information, and communicate clearly, the more room pathogens have to spread. And if people don't trust the messengers because of misinformation or because they've seen their communities ignored in the past, it doesn't matter how good your science is, your advice will not land. Lesson number 5, we have to break the cycle of panic and neglect. After every crisis, there's a rush of funding and attention, followed by a slow fade as other priorities crowd in. The WHO's message is that preparedness has to be wired into laws, budgets, and routine practice. That's part of what the new WHO pandemic agreement and the updated international health regulations are supposed to do. Clarify obligations, set expectations for data sharing, and create more accountability when countries drag their feet. Lesson number 6, governance matters. When responsibility is unclear, when response ultimately then slows. The pandemic agreement and IHR amendments are attempts to define who does what and when. So we're not improvising a chain of command in the middle of an emergency. That may sound dull, but improvising a chain of command in the middle of an emergency is not what you want to do when you have a new respiratory virus that's spreading fast. So we need to know who has the authority to close schools, allocate vaccines, or what have you. And this needs to be done within a coordinated action as opposed to finger pointing. So lesson number 7, and the final lesson, I think one of the most important, is that One Health is not a slogan. It's a survival strategy. Most new threats emerge where humans, animal, and environmental health intersect. Live animal markets, intensive farming, deforestation, climate-driven shifts into vectors. Okay, so the WHO is now pushing for preparedness plans that include agriculture, wildlife, and environment ministries alongside health so that we address spillover risk at the source instead of just trying to mop up after the fact. So notice how all this loops back to tonight's story. Cyclospora on lettuce grows in Mexico and is eaten in Michigan. That's One Health, and it's an equity problem. It's a water quality standards, agricultural oversight, and the value we place on the health of the people who grow and process our food. Measles roaring back in the US is a governance and trust problem. We have the vaccine, but we've allowed policy and politics to erode coverage and to leave room for misinformation. The WHO's global plans only matter if national and local policymakers actually invest in labs, data systems, and community health workers instead of cutting their budgets the moment the immediate crisis ebbs. So here's the through line that I want you to hear. Public health failures are almost always policy failures first. This summer, Cyclospora surge, more than 4,000 confirmed cases, over 7,400 additional suspected, and multiple overlapping produce-linked clusters is not just about a parasite that got lucky. It's about choices that we've made to tolerate weak oversight in food production, to underfund surveillance and lab capacity, and to accept that people with the least power will be the ones stuck with the worst consequences. The same is true for measles. More than 2,200 cases in a country that once declared measles eliminated is not a so-called all of a sudden mysterious return. It's a mirror reflecting vaccine policy, school entry laws, and how seriously or not we take misinformation. And finally, the WHO's pandemic lessons are only lessons if they change how we write budgets, design health systems, and share power across borders. Otherwise, they're just well-edited speeches. If we really want a different future, we have to decide that prevention is non-negotiable as paving highways. That means stable funding for public health, real teeth behind food and water safety rules, and investment in local and global lab and surveillance capacity, and a commitment to equity so that communities with the least voice are no longer the ones absorbing the greatest risk. So this is Resistance Radio, where natural selection selects resistance, and we're here to insist that the next time nature tests our systems, it's our policies, not our people, that evolve for the better. My name is Mark Allanderi. Thank you so much for tuning in.